Hey, listeners, before we get started today, I want to give a quick shout out and word to our sponsor, our very first sponsor, Rapido Solutions Group. Danny Frisco and Roberto Icaza, two longtime friends of mine, guys I've known for 10 plus years, the CEO and COO respectively and co-founders of Rapido Solutions Group. These guys know what they're doing. I'm excited to be partnered with them to give you a little glimpse into their business. Rapido connects logistics and supply chain organizations in North America with the best nearshore talent to scale efficiently, operate on par with U.S.-based teams, and deliver superior customer service. These guys work with businesses from all sides of the industry, 3PLs, carriers, logistics, software companies, whatever it may be. They'll build out a team and support whatever roles you need, whether it's customer, carrier sales support, back office, or tech services. These guys know logistics. They know people. It's what sets them apart in this industry. They're driven by an inside knowledge of how to recruit, hire, and train within the industry and a passion to build better solutions for success. In the current market conditions where everyone is trying to be more efficient, do more with less, nearshoring is the latest and greatest tactic that companies are deploying to do so, and Rapido is a tremendous solution for you. So check them out at gorapido.com. And thank you again for being a sponsor to our show, a great partner. We look forward to working with you. And to our listeners, that's it. Let's get the show on the road. We are back. Welcome back to another episode of the Freight Pod. I'm your host, Andrew Silver. I am joined today by a special guest by the name of Rob Haddock, a gentleman who's spent most, if not his entire career, on the shipper side of the business, working for the very esteemed Coca-Cola, a company that is very near and dear to my heart, as I will get into during the episode. Thanks for joining us today, Rob. How you doing?
Andrew, I'm doing great. I appreciate the opportunity to chat today and share a little bit about my history and insights and how I kind of view the world now that I've graduated from the day-to-day job.
Yep, and I'm sure there are plenty of insights there with, what was it, a 43-year career at Coca-Cola?
43, and I remember, as a new guy, new kid, I'm thinking, hey, this is kind of cool. I'm working for Coke, and then all of a sudden, 4 decades pass by, and it's like, okay, it's time for me to spin away and hand off all of this fun to younger folks who've got the energy and they've got great educational backgrounds, and I've done what I can. It's time to move on. But you'd be surprised how quickly the decades can go by when you're enjoying what you do.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, let's start there. Let's start with kind of take us back. So when you joined Coca-Cola, like, what was your initial role? Can you kind of walk me through the journey there?
Yeah, no, it was in the early 80s, it was a tough market, job market. And even though I had worked on a college degree in management and economics, labor market was pretty rough. So fortunately, during breaks when I was going to school, I would do some part-time work at the local Coca-Cola foods facility up in Ohio. And, I'd work for 6, 8, 10 weeks at a time, over the summer, over breaks. I would do whatever menial job that was available. And when I finished in 83, market was still soft for management type folks. So I rejoined the organization as a day laborer, working as a union associate, which was a great learning experience because I was working on running machines, or there was a time where I was the blender operator for making the batches of product before it went on to packaging. So for the first couple of years of my career, I was doing all of those fun jobs that are basically the ground up roles.
Yep.
Really knowing the inside. I was part of the first manufacturing team that was making the little 250 ml drink boxes. And talk about a workout, because I was the palletizer. There was no automated palletizer. I was hand stacking cases as they came off the end of the line. So do that for 8 hours and you can, see how many calories you can burn. But one thing led to another. Eventually, an opportunity in the warehouse operations opened up, and since I'd had the experience of what the manufacturing was, and the economics and the management background, I said, well, hey, why not? Let's go learn something about logistics and warehouse management. And before you know it, I was doing production planning and inventory management and customer service, and it just went from one thing to another to another to another, Andrew, until I got a shot to get into corporate office in Houston at the time, and then eventually found myself in Atlanta at the Coca-Cola World Headquarters, all supporting the North America business unit, which makes the juices, the teas, the waters, the Powerades, Minute Maids, etc.,
And of course, Coca-Cola itself.
and Coca-Cola itself. Yes.
And let me ask you, clearly a number of roles, 10, 20, it sounds like, over the course of time. Were those changes intentional? Like you were constantly trying to do something new, or what was kind of the mindset that led to that kind of evolution of your roles over the years?
The company was changing. Coke Foods was separate from the bottling side of the business for the first part of my career, and it was just things that came up. I really didn't have shame on me. I really didn't say that, hey, in 5 years I wanted to be X. But what I had was the attitude that if somebody came to me with an opportunity, I said, well, why not? Um, yeah, I'm open to that. Let's give it a try. I may not know much about it, but I'd like to learn. So, job changes. I started in Ohio. I went to New Jersey for a larger role, then down to Houston for a centralized planning role, which eventually led to Atlanta as the Coke Foods separate entity was absorbed into what eventually became Coca-Cola North America. And along the way, the size of the organization just allowed new opportunities. And I don't know if it's the same. I don't think it's the same way where people are bouncing back and forth. You seem to be more stuck in a pyramid or in a silo, from what I can tell in today's world. But back then, logistics, supply chain was all relatively new, and there was, I believe, a lot more flexibility because we didn't have specialized degrees in supply chain. You came out with a management degree or an economics degree or maybe an operations degree or procurement. So the less people knew about what the skill sets that were required, we kind of made them up as we went, which allowed for more flexibility.
And let's just focus on the last 10 years. What did your
Mhm.
role look like?
We went through, we being the organization, went through some organizational structural changes. It went from Coke North America to Coca-Cola Refreshments, which was the absorption of all of Coca-Cola Enterprises and the rebranding of franchises, which then split out, basically dismantled Coca-Cola Enterprises, made all of the regional bottlers bigger, and then North America reemerged probably almost 10 years ago. At that time, I was responsible for North America's supply planning and logistics, which was a really interesting role because I got to see everything from S&OP to demand shaping to warehouse management to transportation execution. And then as I got into probably my last 5 to 6 roles, additional org structure changes led me to just focus on transportation, which started with kind of rebuilding the transportation department within Coke North America as we came out of the most recent reorganization. And then when I finally graduated into transportation strategy, kind of to wind down the last year of my time with the company, and that was really trying to capture everything that I had learned about transportation and how it integrated back into the planning and the S&OP process, and making sure that I left some legacy documents for the future generations to follow. So it
It-
was a great run, Andrew. I still can't believe it's been a year since I stopped.
yeah. I mean, I bet it can be challenging, having spent so much time in that space.
I stay involved. The opportunities like talking to you today is just a great opportunity to share, because now that I'm in this state of life, I'd like to just give back. I'd hate to just waste all of the stuff that maybe I'm experienced over the years and keep it to myself. Perhaps I can help somebody else fast track them, reduce their learning curve per se.
It's interesting. I don't even know if I should bring this up because I'm not that well educated on it, but there's a guy named Arthur Brooks. He's a professor at Harvard Business School, and he teaches the most popular elective in the school. Can you guess what that elective could be on?
I don't know, logistics, I'm hoping.
No, happiness.
Oh, happiness.
Happiness. And I saw an hour-long speech he gave. And in it, he talks about a little bit about the way our brains work and how we learn and basically what we're best at certain periods of our life. And what they found is until you're about 40 years old, that's when there's like a clear pivot in terms of what our brain is best at. And up until 40, we're best at being like in a business, operating and executing. And then after 40, we are way better at teaching and delegating and passing on information. And it's kind of this journey of happiness where like people who spend in their 50s, 60s, 70s continuing to try to operate and execute, it gets harder and harder for them to find true happiness. Whereas the people that make that pivot tend to find happiness more quickly or more easily when they're focused on kind of what you're doing now. So I don't know. That's just from a professor at Harvard as a side note.
Well, and I think that's interesting. There's a book out there, and I forgive me if I mess up, but I think it's Strength to Strength, and it's talking about you've got fluid intelligence when you're younger in your career, and you're everything's firing on all cylinders, and you're creating solutions for unsolvable problems. But then as you start to mature, your intelligence becomes a little more crystallized. And that crystallized intelligence adds value back to others who are earlier in their journey if you realize that is now your role. So I've really embraced that role of, hey, if you want to pick my brain on stuff, just give me a call. I'm out there on LinkedIn, cell phones out there. I'm always open to talk supply chain and logistics.
So do you know who wrote that book, Strength to Strength?
I can look it up.
It's the guy who I just mentioned, and what you just described is actually a way better explanation of what I was trying to describe. It's funny that we just made that connection, but that's exactly what he was talking about. So spot on. But that was aside. We'll put that aside for a second.
No, that's pretty cool.
I did want to ask though. You mentioned the organizational changes that Coca-Cola went through. And they seem to be every 2-3 years where there was another huge kind of organizational change. What was the catalyst for those changes?
Well, I think, even though, Coke has been market leader for a long time and continues to do very well, there's a lot of folks who want that position in the marketplace, and you continue to refine. If you don't, there's many companies that aren't around anymore. So there's subtle changes here and there. There's acquisitions of different brands that slowly become integrated into, the larger entity. And, sometimes the work doesn't necessarily change, but the org structure supporting the work might be better aligned this way. And I think, where we left it, and I think it's still in place, is that, logistics and customer service were very closely linked together, interacting very closely with the manufacturing folks and, bringing it all together through S&OP processes with senior leadership. And that seemed to make sure that, sometimes logistics doesn't get heard, especially when you might be in a sales and marketing organization. And that structure seemed to help give us a voice, because what I've told folks a long time ago is that in logistics is that our job is to make the sales and marketing dreams come true, and not to give a customer a reason to go ahead and buy another product. So we got to make sure that we know what we're doing, we have the product available, and we can get it on a truck, and we get it to a customer, and we keep the cost on budget. If we can check those 3 or 4 boxes, we're going to be okay. No one's going to want to help us, run the operations. The moment we start to, falter from that, we're going to have a whole lot of help that has been hasn't been asked for. And I think the structural changes, you have to be nimble in ever-changing marketplace. So, I mean, the changes aren't draconian, but they're enough to say, okay, we're going to do it slightly different until the next market requirement dictates that we do something slightly different.
Yeah, so because I was thinking about transportation and logistics in the background of big organizational changes, and my gut instinct tells me that often transportation is the last thing thought of when those changes are necessarily made. And so I'm curious what the impact has been to the transportation and logistics group and the carriers that are, managing that business when those big changes tend to happen.
What I've seen, Andrew, and I was fortunate that I was able to go through multiple org structure changes and still stay in a role that allowed me to have the ability to influence how we went to market and how we interacted with the carriers, which really, look jumping forward, it really helped us with shipper of choice behaviors. I know other organizations aren't as fortunate. They have some leaders in logistics that kind of pass through, and maybe folks are trying to make their mark quickly, and that may not be the best behavior for the long term in a carrier shipper relationship. Um, but that's part of my advocacy, is to try and change that mindset. Is that we're in this business together, um, and I hate to see all the hard work of everybody upstream in the supply chain and all the called the advertising, the on shelf marketing, only to have the truck not show up and have the customer upset. It just seems like a waste. So, tight collaboration with your carrier partners is just essential to continue to keep that product moving and meet all the customer expectations.
And you mentioned before, our job is to, I think it was to help make sales and marketing's dreams come true. And I like that. I'm curious, did you often find or sometimes find that sales and marketing could have kind of unrealistic dreams that made it, how do you think about that, and what kind of challenges could that create, or how do you navigate that?
There's this traditional sales and operations planning processes that sometimes aren't administered very well. But we learn through trial and error that if you stay true to that, you've got to make sure that the the marketing side of the operation or the business understands that there are limitations to what either manufacturing can do or warehousing can do or transportation can do. And it starts all the way upstream, perhaps in product development, to make sure that if you're going to launch a product, make sure that at least the origin and the destination are in close proximity. I can remember so many times where we're going to manufacture something in one part of the country, and oh, guess what? The test market's on the other side of the country. But you got to keep inventory low, cost in line, and service high. It's like, well, sometimes those things aren't going to align very well. So you have to let everybody know that here are the risks, here are the costs to achieve those types of objectives, and then you just want to and monitor how well things are going and try and pivot as much as possible. Um, a lot of times, supply chain maybe doesn't get the credit that it deserves for making things happen. I teased everyone during the pandemic that for years, my family had no idea what I did. They just knew I was in Coke and I was in supply chain. And then when things failed in terms of delivery in the US and we didn't have all of our stuff on shelf, now folks knew that, oh, you're part of the problem because apparently you don't do your job very well. Um, what it emphasizes is that most supply chains are running just on razor's edge, and sometimes a long holiday weekend or a winter storm would be disruptive enough that you're not getting product to where it needs to be. Try doing that type of having that type of pressure over a pandemic that lasted, what, 18, 24 months.
Hmm.
um, and a lot of supply chains were resilient. A lot of supply chains really struggled to get the right product on shelf, and it took them a while to recover. Uh, I would say that, the supply chain that I was leading, we did fairly well from a transportation perspective because we learned a great lesson in 2018 when the ELD mandate really caused capacity to shrink, and we put in a lot of technologies and processes and incremental people during that time period, which we fared better during the pandemic than I think some of our peers did. And it's I did something a resiliency roadmap where I look back over time and I said all these little small things that we did over this last 5-year period since 2018 really helped us weather some of the most toughest challenges with moving freight during the pandemic period.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what some of that looked like in terms of building a resiliency roadmap and how you guys navigated either the ELD period in 2018 or how it set you up for success when the pandemic hit?
Yeah, I think in 18 I was in the CEO's office almost every week explaining why things were not being delivered and why things were so expensive. And I was just basically told, what do you need to fix it? So we upgraded our TMS and got it as current as possible. We looked at our carrier base and started to focus on fewer is better and help start building strategic relationships versus more transactional. Um, we also had the opportunity that we really didn't have a wall between the procurement and the operations team within transportation because restructuring, basically the procurement group got restructured to another part of the organization. So we were on our own. So we didn't have to worry about that. One group getting it for low cost and then the other group trying to figure out if this is going to work from a service perspective. Uh, so we learned by implementing better technology. We got a lot smarter when it comes to industry insights, leveraging some companies like DAT and FreightWaves, and even Transplace's tools that were available to us. So we really knew what we were talking about when we were looking at what should a lane cost. Um, we focused on shipper of choice and were some of our issues self-inflicted because our facilities were not doing a very good job of honoring appointments and delaying carriers. And then everything, kind of ended when we were facing OTIF fines. So a lot of retailers said, well, if you're not going to be here on time, we're going to penalize you. That really gets your attention when it starts to add up fast. So Andrew, you get really creative on what technology and what processes and people you need to stop some of that. And the investments were far minimal compared to the penalties that we maybe we're going to be faced with, and the lack of sales that kind of resulted when it made it difficult for a salesperson to go in and sell a new item when we were having trouble delivering the ones that we had promised last time we were there. So when you bundle that all together, that resiliency roadmap became very clear as to here are the multiple steps that we did, and it paid off in the end.
And is that there? First of all, there's like 18 talking points I could spend 10
Yeah,
minutes with you
I know.
on just in that answer,
I
and
know.
we're going to get to a bunch of them.
I did a
But that last
keynote.
comment,
I did a
go ahead.
keynote on that this topic a year ago, and kind of walked everybody through the roadmap as to here's how it all came together. Didn't know it was happening at the time, but when I look back, I said, "Hey, that worked out all right." It was serendipitous resiliency, I think, was the title.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, I'll touch on the last comment
Yeah.
first, because I don't think it's something that us transportation folks, on the other side, whether it's the carriers or brokers, necessarily think about too often. But thinking about the sales team at Coca-Cola, and is there truly an impact that they might find in trying to get this next SKU sold, but the last one in their relationship with Walmart or Target or whoever, there were serious delivery issues and product not getting there on time. Does that actually truly impact their ability to make the next sale?
It does. I was fortunate enough to go on a number of calls with the sales teams when they were doing their top to tops, and And a few of them during the meeting said, the only reason you guys are in here talking to us about new items is because you are one of the best in class in terms of on-time service. And when you hear words like that, that resonates just how important it is to focus on the service segment, especially with, we deliver to a broad grouping of different customers. So grocery retail is very sensitive to it. If you deliver to food service accounts, those are very sensitive, because if it's not at the food service distributor, there might be a up and down the street outlet that doesn't have the product. So it really hits home that for sales and marketing to be able to do what they do, you've got to have a good service record. And the customers will tell you that if you can't deliver what you promised last time, why should I buy anything else?
Yeah. And what do you think? And I don't know if ideal is the right word, but what does a strong strategy look like internally within a shipper, enterprise shipper, even middle market,
Hmm.
for how to make sales, marketing, and transportation operations, like, what should their working relationship look like? Um, or what are things that you found were really successful in how you, because I think it's cool to
Yeah.
hear that you would actually go to the sales meetings, top to top, and be able to sit in that conversation and have a voice. I'm just curious if there are other things that you saw that really worked or created better strength within the business.
I think a lot of times I've also been the one that's been brought into a sales meeting and said, this is he's the problem, but he's going to fix it also. So there are happy endings and there's been not so happy endings. Um, I think what helped me is that I was able to communicate up and down the supply chain and the marketing teams, knowing the marketing side of the business and interacting with the sales folks, if not daily, but at least weekly. Um, One of my early learnings in in the Minute Maid company was that would have a sales and operations execution meeting every Monday morning, and we would talk about where supply was and then what's coming up with that sales and what the failures were. And this was probably a room of 50 to 70 people, mostly senior leader manufacturing, supply chain, sales, and marketing. And it was just having the ability, learning the ability to speak to them in terminology that they understood, and give them perspectives as to what is real, what's not real, and get to the point of what do we need to do to fix stuff, so we don't have continued failures. Uh, Great learning experience. I'm not sure if everybody who's been in my role has had that opportunity, uh, but sales and operations planning and sales and operation execution meetings, if they're done well, they can really build the collaboration between those various groups.
Yep, that makes sense. And then I also want to talk about, you mentioned kind of not having a wall between procurement and operations. And I think the way that procurement and operations work together or don't, can have a critical impact on a company's ability to execute, especially execute to budget.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you could share some perspective on what you think the ideal working relationship looks like between procurement and operations, and maybe where you've seen things go awry when they're misaligned.
I think at the end, Andrew, you've got to have an all-inclusive view of the financial impact of your transportation. So, historically, maybe an organization would look at, well, here's my rate per mile. And then somewhere else on another balance sheet, there would be OTIF penalties. And somewhere else, there would be another deduction, customer deduction, et cetera. And folks would look at those independently and not really pull them all together to say, okay, this is not working well, and then go back and fix it. What we were able to do was to look at those different balance sheets and kind of meld them all together and say, listen, this is a high profile customer. I need service expectations of Y. The only way I can get it is to pay a slight premium, perhaps to carriers X and Y. And I'm not going to go out and, bid it to everybody who says that they have capability. and get caught in this paper rate death spiral. Um, yeah, need to work with carriers who know the business, and who can tell us if we're doing something wrong that is prohibiting their ability to be successful. So taking that more holistic view of the actual cost to deliver was very helpful to make sure that we could, in the areas where we needed premium service, this is what we're going to spend. If there were maybe plant to plant moves where I know I have inventory at another facility, maybe let's go ahead and find something that's a little more reasonably priced. But you'd have to stratify your customer service expectations, which then led to, what's my potential primary tender acceptance, what's my potential on-time delivery, put that all into a big math equation, and then work with a finance team to say, okay, we're on budget, we're not on budget. I think the other thing that the organization did over the last decade was build out some of the most robust reporting tools that sat on top of the TMS system that I think even today they're probably well ahead of what other companies have to work with.
And was that in-house built or outside vendors?
It was in-house built. I remember maybe 5, 6 years ago, our TMS provider came to us and said, "Hey, we've got this really new reporting tool, um, and for a mere fraction of a gazillion dollars, it's yours." And we looked at it and said, "Thanks, no thanks." We passed that bridge 5 years ago in stuff that we developed in-house. Um, Come back when you have something that's a little more sophisticated than what we have today.
Yeah, that seems. I mean, it reminds me of there's a business, Good Ship, that I know the founder, and that's the same thing. It sounds like you're talking about. It sits on the TMS and has a lot of reporting capabilities that gives a more in depth look at the business and the service and the execution. Because I think your point was kind of spot on, and it was exactly kind of what I thought you would head on to or speak about was kind of the notion of the paper rate. And I really think the challenge is when procurement has all of the bid power, but operations has all the day to day insight. And if they aren't working collaboratively enough, procurement just will put carriers on that have the lowest rate on paper. And the after effect of that is generally not good.
You can get away with it in a loose market, perhaps, where we're living right now, Andrew. But if you've got a market that is tightening or projected to tighten, it's not worth the risk, because if on December 31st that rate looks fantastic and you're all high fiving because your budget for next year looks beautiful, and then on January 1st your failures start to add up, it can be very expensive to go back to the market and try and find capacity, and then you live with that all year long.
And carriers and brokers don't necessarily have a short memory with respect to that.
Oh,
So,
no, no.
if you take away the business they've taken care of for you for a year, 2 years, because you saved 5 cents with some new carrier, and then you come back to them in 6 months saying, "Hey, I need you to take it." The easy part of the market is gone. I need you to take it at the hard part. They're going to tack on another 30, 40, 50 cents a mile. And in the end, you're paying way more than you thought you'd be.
Yeah, I mean, I know over the time that I've been in transportation, we've made that mistake a few times, and it's like, yeah, let's stop doing that, because we know the ending, and we can avoid everybody a little bit of pain. And what I'd coach people is that I'd love to go and just tell the finance team and tell the marketing team that it's going to cost us this to deliver the freight with a high degree of accuracy, and if we're a little bit too bullish, we'll give you some money back. That's a much easier conversation than having to go to finance every month and explain why you overspent again and ask for more money. Because it
Yeah,
doesn't
that.
just grow on a tree, it's got to come from somewhere else in the organization.
Yep. You made a comment earlier about being in the CEO's office every week. I think that was during the ELD mandate period.
Yeah.
And then, I distinctly remember seeing stuff on LinkedIn and really articles everywhere, whether it was Wall Street Journal or whoever. And this was mostly during the pandemic, where it was like all of a sudden everybody knows what the supply chain is and knows about the chief supply chain officer, like things like that. And I'm just curious, like, do you feel like, with all that's happened in the last 5 years, that finally transportation has a voice within a business that gives it the kind of power it needs to make the real impact?
I think it has, but Andrew, it may have waned a little bit because we've been in such an extended period where rates have been so reasonable. In fact, I was looking at just some information this morning where ATRI just put out their operational cost of trucking report for 2024, and it was somewhere around $2.25 a mile was the number that stuck out. And then I was comparing that to FreightWaves rates, where folks are paying 225 or less per mile, and I'm going, that's going to be a problem,
Yeah, that math
because
doesn't math.
the math, it's not sustainable, um, and that just leads me to going, okay, we're getting a great rate is fine, but if all of a sudden there's a mass exodus of capacity, then we're right back in the mess again.
Yep. And I mean, it just all things point to just inflated cost at some point, and it just at the very the most important thing to understand is the cost for the trucking company to operate the truck, because that should set the bar, or at least the minimum, that any lane should cost to move. It really should be that plus 10% or whatever, so they can make some money, whatever, a percentage, so they can make money. But we have been in this extended period of time where the rates being paid are below that minimum. And, people refer to kind of the war chest that carriers were able to build up during the peak of the pandemic. And, maybe that's just the cyclical nature of this industry. But what I don't see ever happening are those minimum costs for the carrier going down.
No, I mean, it's inflationary. There's the only thing, fuel did go down from 23, but that was explained by just the increased cost of fuel and the supply. Other things have gone up. So I think overall between this year and last year, the ATRI report shows like a 3 cents per mile increase. So whether it's insurance or EOM parts or the cost of new equipment, that has been inflationary. And any business knows that, if you're selling stuff for less than it costs you to make it, that's not a formula for success. So, a wise transportation organization will understand when it might be pushing the procurement process a little too hard, kind of
Yep.
leave some meat on the bones, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, that ties in nicely to the next topic I want to hit on, which is the shipper of choice concept or doctrine. Can you tell me what that means to you?
When I started way back when, Andrew, oh gosh, back in the 80s, and I was in that warehouse role, and it was a one-stop shop. So I was doing procurement, I was doing tendering loads, finance carriers, et cetera, et cetera. Also dealing with the drivers, and we would see so many drivers who had a long day. They were running a little bit late. And we did the best to get them in and out as quickly as possible. Yeah, it was a small operation, so I had the freedom to keep a few folks over, uh, and say, hey, let's stage the load. As soon as the driver gets there, let's get them on their way because they're beat, and let's just at least give them a Coke, smile at them, and get them on their way so they can go rest. And that kind of stuck with me because that job as a driver is tough. Not many people want to do it. Fewer and fewer want to do it day in and day out. And those that are doing it want the runs that are perhaps getting them home every night. So the long haul driver, which a lot of freight still requires that, those drivers are aging out. So when I got into influential roles within transportation, I thought there's two things we got to do. One, we have got to be good stewards with our carrier partners in the management team, in the management space. Let's really behave like business partners. And then when you get over to the interaction with the drivers, let's make sure that it's a welcome center, not a guard shack. Let's make sure that we smile and show them where the facilities are and there's vending machines, and let's not let them sit around all day. Let's get them on their way. And if we can do that, then there's opportunity that we can be a shipper of choice. Now, I've done a lot of research. Shipper of choice may not get rates any lower than anybody else when it comes to a cost perspective, but they will get capacity when times get tight because the carrier management team wants to deal with somebody who's in a partnership relationship. And the other thing is that drivers talk amongst themselves, and we've seen that facility ratings have merit. And the lower the facility rating, the chances are that the driver is going to say, "There's no way I'm taking that tender because I know I'm going to sit there for 3 hours, and it's not built into the rate. You've got to raise the rate." Um, I've seen a couple of locations within the network that had basically low ratings, and there was a strong correlation to a higher rate per mile than perhaps that market would indicate. And when you dig into it, dwell time wasn't being managed very well, or appointments weren't being managed, and there, didn't have a drop yard. So a little bit of investment went a long way to smooth out the operations. I mean, all of that kind of speaks to this is a limited resource that we all share across the industry. Let's make sure we keep the drivers moving, and let's be professional about it.
I think there's some great points in there and probably another 7 talking points we can hit on. So I want to start with the facility ratings
Yeah.
concept. When were you first introduced to facility ratings? Is that something that came through a third party provider by chance, a carrier or a broker?
It was kind of started to spill over because you were seeing ratings on restaurants, ratings on hotels. Um, and, you rate your Uber driver. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and we started to kick around the idea, and I don't know if it was just, a group of us with, across, I was involved with Consumer Brands Association, which so a lot of shippers there. We were talking about reducing dwell time as an industry for the CPG shippers, and facility ratings were starting to get some merit. And then I worked with the Uber team for a while, who put out a facility ratings dashboard or tool where drivers were providing feedback as to what their experiences were like. And then, I worked with the Uber team to help them say, well, listen, you've got to quantify what a 2 versus a 3 versus a 4 means to really get the attention, because I think there's two costs associated with the ratings, Andrew. There's the obvious cost, which is a detention because you kept a driver late longer than the 2 hour gratis.
Yep.
There's also an inconvenience factor that is probably built into the rate up front, because the carrier may want to take the load, but they know that there's risk that load or unload on that OD pair might not go as efficiently as possible. So you might have on $1,000, freight bill, there may be $100 of inefficiency penalty built into the front end. And if the driver faced detention on either the front or the backside, you may have another $100. So, when you compare this OD pairing versus what should be a $900 rate, why am I paying $1,100 as a shipper? It's like, well, you've got some inefficient operations. So it challenges the shipper and the receiver. Probably all falls back on the shipper because they paid attention on both ends to really understand, am I doing what I need to as a shipper to make sure the drivers are moving in and out quickly?
Yeah. So I didn't want to lead the horse to water there, but that
Hmm.
was what I was getting at when I asked that, because, if there's one, I don't think there's been in the brokerage space like a ton of crazy new innovation in the last 10 years. I mean, I think there's some digital things that have moved that part of the business forward. But one of the things that I thought was really cool that Uber did was the facility ratings concept.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very new to the industry, and the way they were able to do it, because all of their drivers were already on the app and it was something we were all familiar with. I really thought that was a new and value added insight that shippers were able to get through them. And so I was curious if that's what you were going to say when I asked that. And it sounds like it clearly was something not only that they did, but you helped them with, and clearly added value.
There was the predecessor to that too. Doc 411 started to try and get some visibility to what carriers were experiencing or drivers were experiencing facilities. And I don't think it got off the ground as much. And I know there's a resurgence of Doc 411 that should be kind of connected to what Uber's doing. So, what if some of the different companies combine forces, all in the spirit of reducing dwell time and providing awareness to what's going on out there, I think it might change the mindset a little bit easier. But that's probably another hour-long discussion with some of
Yeah.
the folks that are in that space.
And then the other thing you said that I will validate for you is the comment around kind of upfront risk cost that gets added to a freight rate from a carrier if a facility is one that they have concern about. And I can speak from very direct experience. I got my startup in the industry with Coyote, and the
Mhm.
first 5 years of that, I was a carrier rep, and I was tasked with working on our freight inbound to the Southeast. And this was 2007 through 2011 or so, which is right around the time that Coyote became a very big carrier for Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
And frankly, Coca-Cola was essentially the most important customer. Not every customer was extremely important, but we were very all in on making sure that Coca-Cola's freight was taken care of exceptionally well. And so what my dad essentially told me was, you're going to make sure these Coke loads move. And so you better find carriers to cover them. So I worked with a lot of owner operators on covering your loads from Atlanta into Florida, and then some loads back from Florida out into Alabama, Tennessee, whatever. But I distinctly remember some of the time there were one or two facilities in Atlanta that were a real challenge for drivers back then.
Yep.
And I remember Peter Achukwu, who was an owner operator. When I would offer him a Coke load out of Atlanta, he'd say, "Andrew, come on, man. I don't like going to that place. Like you're going to have to give me an extra $50 to go deal with that, please." And like, that was a front end thing, regardless of it. We didn't know if he'd be there for an hour or 5 hours, but just to get him to commit, I was paying a little bit extra. And, it's not so to validate your thoughts there. There's truth to that.
And I've worked with a few folks, and there's an estimated 2 million shipping and receiving docks in the United States. And granted, the majority of them are probably pretty efficient. But even if there's 100,000 of them that are not, that is really a slowdown on the whole ecosystem. And there's got to be some way to compensate for that. And that's where you build in that little bit of that inefficiency penalty, just because you don't know is it going to be a good day or a bad day.
Yep. The next thing I want to talk about here with respect to your comments around shipper of choice was being a good partner with your carriers. Can you talk a little bit about some detail to what that looks like?
Yeah, and there's the traditional quarterly business review, probably with your larger premier carrier partners, and then for every one of your carriers, you should at least have an annual business check-in with them. It may be in person, it may be over the phone, but if they're part of your portfolio, let's have a little bit of collaboration. There should also, if you're an enterprise shipper or you can afford to do it, you should have an annual carrier summit. You know, the Coke system does that very well. Brings in everybody, outlines what the expectations are for the upcoming year, some inside scoop on what's going on with the business, and it just builds that relationship, that collaboration. And it closes out by awarding carriers for their efforts from the prior year. So it's really nicely done. And I know a lot of large enterprise shippers do that. So that's a great practice. But it's it's talking about when you do get in the quarterly business reviews. I'm big on something that the Coyote team started to play around with and did some research on, was around shared metrics. And I've even had a call with them just recently to talk about where are we with these 5 shared metrics that are, some of the accountabilities are the shippers, some of the accountabilities are the carriers, some of the accountabilities are truly shared. So if you were to look at 5 metrics, I think a shipper is very responsible for giving the carrier a good demand signal, because we know without a good demand signal, a good forecast, how can anybody plan for success? And then shippers should be very conscientious about dwell time and detention time, and not only at the shipper, but the receiving location. So that would be on the shipper. Primary tender acceptance and on-time performance would be on the carrier. and then you got to get to some type of cost improvement model. So if you are currently shipping it for X per mile, is there anything in there that's inefficient that together the two individual companies can work on to help reduce the cost on that particular lane? So when I think about what does a great relationship look like, it's quarterly business review, a little bit of talk about the past, but what are we going to do going forward?
And I like the notion of taking the two or so most important controllables on each side and making those the focal point within that, right? So primary tender acceptance and uh, on-time service from the carrier side. Those are the probably two of the most important things that we can control. And then the same on the other side for the shipper side. And I think when you put that together, it aligns the vision of the two organizations to get the kind of mutual goals accomplished.
And they're all interlinked when you think about it, Andrew, because if I've got a bad forecast, and you're throwing all kinds of crazy volume at me, well, how am I going to tender at the level? How are you going to keep the cost on that lane accurate? Or if I'm delaying trucks, um, or if I as a carrier overcommitted, but I wasn't willing to commit to or own up to the fact that, yeah, I told you I would take 10, but I can only do 5. Well, let's go back to the table. It's okay to tell us that you can only do 5 because maybe something else in your network changed. Give us enough warning, that the shipper can recalibrate and maybe partner with somebody else who has more strength in that lane. But you can't have that without the business reviews
Yeah,
and
and that's
and
go ahead.
trust.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point though too because I might commit to you might tell me it's going to be let's say 20 loads a week, and I commit to taking 20 loads a week for you. But then you send me, 1 week, there's a crazy bump or it's super volatile. And so for 4 straight weeks, I only get 5 tenders. And then the fifth week you send me my 20 and then you're hitting me like, why was your tender
Yeah.
acceptance down? It's like, well, my capacity went elsewhere when I was only giving them 5 a week. So I get how they're definitely linked and there's got to be mutual accountability there.
Yeah. And honestly, in the food business, humans can only consume so much. Um, and why we have these erratic swings between high and low, it's multifaceted. One is that ERP systems actually aren't very smart, especially when they're probably the master data is not set up, so they create these bullwhip effects. And then promotional volume. Um, who would have thought we were going to have more charcoal around the 4th of July? We know stuff like that is going to happen well in advance. Let's go ahead and plan for it, alert everybody. One of our big initiatives, which is still in place, is making sure that lane volume management is something that is monitored very closely and shared with the carriers as to what are the upcoming expectations over the next 30, 45 days.
And then you mentioned earlier that with respect to carrier network, that fewer can be better. And I'm just curious from your perspective, what does the ideal network look like or did look like for your business in terms of how many carriers, how many are assets versus brokers? Does the
Mhm.
delineation even matter anymore, or is it this kind of hybrid model?
What I noticed is if it's the if you've got a business that is a call it more repeatable or more stable, then you want to get into call it a dedicated fleet, or you want to have an asset based carrier assigned to it. If you've got a business that has call it peak season, most of the time the brokerage networks are able to flex better to cover peak, and you tend to go ahead and lean your volume towards that. So we really understood between our different business units and our different temperature control what what was our optimal carrier base mix between brokers, dry brokers, refrigerated, and then asset based carriers. The service expectations and the interacting, it's almost well, a lot of times we were getting better performance out of our broker community than we actually were the asset-based community, which led to different questions as to are you with us or not? I know when I started, the business was much smaller and there were 4 times the number of carriers involved, Andrew. Um, it was all transactional. By the time I left, the business had doubled and we dropped that carrier base down to about 25% of where we started.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to manage quarterly business reviews when you have only a handful of people to have to go talk to.
Of course. And I just think when you can give a meaningful wallet share to a provider, it's way more likely for them to be fully invested in your business.
Mhm. Yep, yep. Because you don't want them having any second thoughts as to when things get tough. You want to make sure that folks aren't going to get lured away.
Yep. And how do you then think about new potential carriers? I mean, I have to assume at the peak, at any point in the last 5 years, I mean, how many email requests did you get a day or a week from new providers wanting to just sit down and talk to you?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. One real warning sign for me and some of the team was, someone would call up and say, "Hey, we'd love to haul for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your business?" Um, it's like, well, you should already know a little bit about our business if you're reaching out to us. Um, but we do. Um, we historically did and still do invite new carrier prospects after they've been vetted to the annual bid process. I would tell you that if we try 10 or 15, maybe only one or two will be around after the first quarter, because
Really?
they didn't really understand what they were getting into.
Wow, that's crazy to me that that high of a percentage of companies would screw the pooch there with such a big opportunity in front of them.
I know, and it's something. There's high expectations on service.
Yeah. I speak from my own experience that Coca-Cola was the first company I emailed when I started at Molo, and for 5 years I was trying to get an opportunity and never did. And yeah, I used to tell my team that Coca-Cola was my holy grail. And the reason, frankly, is because I don't think Molo would have gotten to, I just don't think my love for this industry came from Coca-Cola and just the competitive nature of wanting to stand out. And again, I think it was a timing thing. Also I think being, the CEO's kid at Coyote was a situation where the way Coyote wanted to stand out and develop the relationship with Coke was anytime you called, we were going to answer and we were going to
Mhm.
show up and execute the business. And I distinctly remember I think it was 2008, 4th of July weekend, your Memphis line shut down. And do you remember that by chance?
No, and Memphis would have been one of the bottlers in the network, and I'm sure they were scrambling to get stuff out of Chattanooga or somewhere
What ended
out of
up
Kansas
happening
City.
was I was in the pool at my house, and my dad he had gotten the email and he looked at me and sternly just said, "Get out."
Oh
And
no.
we went to the office, him and I think it was like 100 loads on the 4th of July, and it was a lot of shuttles from Memphis to West Memphis, and then a ton of stuff either from Dallas to Memphis or Memphis to Dallas, and we just sat there and covered all of them. And it's like that hero mentality of showing up when others won't was indoctrinated in so many Coyotes, and it I think was what drove a lot of us. And then that's kind of what I instilled into my business at Molo, and it was a big reason why I credit Coca-Cola so much for what I've learned now and my kind of career. Um, but I understand how it's just you're probably getting hundreds of carriers wanting the opportunity, and it's really hard to stand out and get that chance. I'm just curious from your perspective, how do you even know which ones to give a shot to when I think people are generally saying a lot of the same things,
Yeah.
that we're going to work our butts off to service for you and execute, and we'll communicate very well, and we'll do all the digital tracking requirements. It's hard to stand out.
It is, and that was one of the things that we tried to emphasize with folks is that you've got to provide differentiation that is at least at or above what our current partners are providing, and that kind of threw a lot of folks back to say, am I willing to say that I can do that? Um, I know I was invited to a conference once, and I was up on stage, and it was a conference with freight brokers, and somebody asked that question, "How do you get into Coke?" I said, "Well, you've got to be able to differentiate. Either you're superior at your tech, you're superior at your service, but you're still going to be able to offer a market attractive rate, and and then we can have a conversation. And if you're unsure of that, keep in mind that the Coke system is very large. There's regional bottlers. There's the North America group, which is quite large. Maybe we'll give you an opportunity on a small plant-to-plant lane just to test whether you have the capability. In today's world, there is a procurement group that does a lot of that vetting up front now, Andrew,
Mhm.
before we even start the bid process. So they'll go through and they'll filter through all of those requests to take a look at our capabilities, and then they will invite a number of them to see if they can manage the bid process, and if they do get awarded, then they're coached as to what they need to do right, and then they're given some time to make sure that they can execute. Sometimes it works out, many times it hasn't.
Yeah. What advice would you give to wanting carriers and brokers who, are thinking about soliciting not just Coca-Cola, but any
Mhm.
enterprise shipper? What would a piece of advice be that you give them as
Well,
they,
I think really know the dynamics of the OD pair itself. Because Coke bottling is very different than Coke North America, which is going to the grocery retail channel. Um, you know, Coke bottling tends to be plant to DC with a very fixed amount of volume. North America can be very dynamic. So, know what Coke you're talking to as a carrier, um, and then understand who's on either end, and what's the volatility of the volume, and what are the characteristics of the shipping and receiving. Um, either ask directly for insights into the facilities, or I always, as a default, before we had Uber helping us out, I would go Google a facility to see what are carriers saying in terms of 1 to 5, 1 to 5 feedback.
yeah. I mean, that reminds me of a tip I got early in my sales career, which was essentially, before you're going to go call the big boss, the director of transportation or whoever it may be, call the facility, call several facilities, and just talk to whoever picks up the phone
Mhm.
and try to get some information. Ask
Yeah.
them about their job, how they're impacted by carriers and brokers, what challenges they have, what works, what doesn't. And the worst that you get is told, "Hey, I don't got time for this," and they hang up on you or whatever. But there's a lot of information you can get if you do the research the right way that puts you in a position to be way better educated. So on that first email, like you said earlier, I'm not emailing you saying, "Hey, Rob, can you tell me about your business?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's not going to work.
No, it's not gonna work, and I would say, a lot of carriers, if you're interested, do you have some strong lanes? Do you have some power lanes that you execute on day in and day out, and you're very confident in? Start with that. Don't try and bid on every lane out there, because that's not the right approach. Prove yourself on a few lanes, and then grow from there.
Yeah, that's good advice. So I want to pivot now a little bit
Mhm.
to a concept that I'm curious your thoughts on, and that is collaboration among shippers. So I know you've been a member of a number of the big organizations that play in our industry, CSCMP, Food Shippers of
Mhm.
America, and some others. I want to understand first and foremost what you think is possible in terms of collaboration among shippers, and then based on that, I'll ask a second question that's maybe a little separate.
Yeah, I think we during the during the ELD meltdown, there was a lot of collaboration going on with, uh, basically sponsored by the Consumer Brands Association, which was the rebranded Grocery Manufacturers of America, which is the CPG shippers. There was 30, 40 of us that were getting together quarterly to talk about what we could do to smooth out um, transportation. A lot of focus on dwell time management and track and trace management. And, there were direct competitors there in the room, but we all knew the rules of the game. And it was really saying, listen, we're all sharing this very valuable resource. If we don't figure this out, there's going to be cost implications and service failures. So let's do what we can. So we started to do some task force, make some inwards. I think out of that, if you're familiar with the freight logistics optimization works flow that the
Mm-hmm.
US DOT is currently running, that came from some of those consumer brand collaboration sessions. Now, flow's at its infancy, but it really speaks to starting to collect data that shows where the bottlenecks are. And through visibility, those bottlenecks can be addressed. They're working on the ports right now. In a couple of years, they'll start to work their way inland to ground transportation. So things like that take time. But that's where shippers were kind of saying, "Listen, we share a valuable resource. Driver community's getting smaller. Let's not waste it."
Yeah, that makes sense. The curiosity I had was, if it would ever be possible to create almost like a network of networks where, rather than just Coca-Cola having to find capacity for its own network that probably has a lot of OD pairs where it's, you know, Atlanta to Miami, which I'm sure there's a ton of volume that ships on that lane, but there's not a ton that's shipping from Miami to Atlanta. But I'm sure there's some produce business that imports a ton to Miami and ships up to Atlanta. And so it was almost like if you could get 10 or 20 or 30 shippers who created a unified network and was able to bid out their freight in a way that made it a lot more efficient for the carrier and for the shipper. And it would be hard, given demand and how that changes and volatility there. But I'm just curious if that could ever play out, or you see a path where that could ever play out where it could work.
The whole concept of these continuous moves, and I tell you, there's been multiple attempts that I've had over the years, and I think rather than the way I think about it is that if you're dealing with an airline or you're dealing with a train or even an ocean vessel, there are set sailings. And I never forget, we were visiting one of the large terminals for UPS up in Chicago. And it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the trailer to the Poughkeepsie was leaving, regardless of what freight was on there. And UPS runs pretty efficient operation. And we run airlines that way, and we run these other transportation industries with a set sail. But with truck transportation, we are highly variable. Um, so rather than say, there's a truck available at any time, night or day, let's just say that, okay, from Atlanta to Miami, every day there's going to be X loads, and then the inverse coming the other way. And if you want to be on there, just like you book an airline ticket, you get on there. That's one idea that I've had as to why haven't we tried to take this resource and make it uniform back and forth versus totally variable.
Yeah. Interesting. I'd love to see how that could play out. It would take some elevated collaboration, which I think is where it gets challenging because everybody has their own, things that matter to them. And it's hard to get that level of commitment. But, I would just like to, I think it would be cool to see something new tried by large companies like that.
I know. I think out of desperation, someday it may get there. But right now, and maybe AI, that's one of the use cases it could play around with, is if you just had some flexibility in your shipping schedule. Um, and sometimes even the days align, but the dock appointment management is just a disaster. So, those two areas there really where a lot of waste is incurred.
Yeah. the level of detail that would have to get um, make work together is just really, really challenging. So, well, listen, this has been extremely insightful. So I truly appreciate you coming on, and I'll end with this one last question here for you. And it's another advice one. So, kind of what advice would you give to just kind of industry professionals? As you know, you've had a long, illustrious career in the space, and you've learned a ton, and now you've gotten to the point of your career where you're teaching a lot. Um, what kind of advice would you give to a young professional in the industry, regardless of what side they're on, whether they're a shipper or a carrier or a broker provider?
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about the fluid versus crystallized intelligence, and I've I've raised 5 individuals who are all in their 20s, early 20s, late 20s, and I have to admit they're the smartest people on the planet until they don't know something. Um, and then that's when they come looking for advice, or they've fallen on their face and they're looking for a hand up. If you're a young professional, don't hesitate to say, "Listen, I don't know it all." There's a huge amount of stuff that's out there, of course, on the internet. Uh, Sometimes it may not exactly make a whole lot of sense. And I know there's a whole lot of folks with that crystallized intelligence that might be interested in giving back a little bit. So, seek out mentors, or I'm always available. Uh, but don't think you have to do it on your own. There's a huge community out there that has some of the inside track. Uh, One of the things I think is starting to happen a little bit with colleges and universities is that they teach some great doctrine based on theory and based on some reality. But it doesn't necessarily always play out well when that associate gets into their that graduate gets into their first job, and it's not exactly what the book said. I think that's the biggest frustration that maybe the company has with a new hire, or that new hire has with, why didn't I get exposed to this? So seek out that additional insight that could be out there readily available if you just realize that maybe you don't know it all on day one.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for young, hungry people is admitting they don't know everything or
Yeah.
being willing to ask for help. But it's a it's a huge difference in what you can attain and learn if you're willing to ask.
hmm
So I think that's really, really great advice, and I appreciate you sharing it.
I think the
So
other thing too, Andrew, and I've as I bounced around the organization so many times, there's one thing that one of the founders of Coke said. Uh, it's there's no limitation to what you can get done or get accomplished if you don't mind who gets the credit. That was one of the things that I always live by. And then another one was that I think there's always a better way. So that's helped me get through my career. And last thing is, I don't know everything. So, build the relationships out there with the folks that maybe have a little more insight as to how this all comes together. And, things may work out fairly well for you.
very nice, very good stuff. I appreciate that. So well, with that, we're going to call it.
Okay,
So
Andrew.
I appreciate you giving me over an hour of your time, and
No
I'm sure my
problem.
audience will as well. So thank you so much. And to our listeners, we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Take care, everyone.